be on my suit and tie shit.
Hello everybody, I'm Waji, and today my group and I are going to talk about how power distance can hinder an employee's ability to reach a company's qualitative goals for Japanese managers with American workers and vice versa in the financial industry, where we are going to focus on the companies Mitsubishi UFJ and Goldman Sachs. And the goal of this presentation is to help better understand the cultural differences between these two companies according to Hofstede's power distance dimension, and how this cultural dimension differs between countries like Japan and the US. One of the main reasons we chose these two companies is due to their vast differences in their corporate culture and the way they do business, which is going to give us a better understanding of how this dimension affects operations of these two companies. By the end of this presentation, we hope to answer some of the misconceptions that some might have about power distance with relation to these two companies, and discuss some of the pros of power distance in order to capitalize on them in the workplace, and define some of the cons of having such differences and how it might affect the workplace. In order to further understand this subject, first we need to define the term power distance, or in other words, the power distance index. And power distance as a definition expresses the degree to which less powerful individuals in a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally in society. And the fundamental issue here is how society handles inequalities, and people in societies exhibiting a large degree of power distance accept a hierarchical order in which everybody has a place and which needs no further justification, where in societies with low power distance, people strive to equalize and distribution of power and demand justification for inequality of power. And basically looking at some of the characteristics between low power distance culture and a high power distance culture, we can see that in low power distance, basically some of its characteristics include minimizing inequalities between employees. Bosses and employees treat each other fairly and they have similar rights. And basically, the ideal boss in a low power distance culture is a Democrat and is open to feedback from different employees. And basically, employees and their bosses have a less formal interaction process. And basically, the variety of salaries in a low power distance culture is very narrow, whereas, as you can see, in a high power distance culture, it's very hierarchical and inequalities are accepted between employees. And basically, employees respect managers, and managers have an expectation that employees obey them no matter what. And basically, the ideal boss in a high power distance culture is autocratic, and basically, this allows for the bosses to have a centralized decision making within the firm. And basically, in terms of social interactions between employees and their bosses, basically it's very formal and it has to be under the terms of rules of the corporation. And basically there is a huge and wide gap in the range of salaries between employees and their bosses. So moving on to the power distance index between the countries Japan and the US, basically we're looking at the three most dominant dimensions of Hofstede that Japan overcomes the US in, and we're looking at the power distance index, the masculinity index, and the uncertainty avoidance. But to focus more on power distance, you can see that power distance in Japan exceeds the one in the US. And basically, this tells us that Japan is borderline hierarchical compared to the US, where power distance is to a lesser degree. And basically, you can see in terms of other dimensions where also masculinity dominates and uncertainty avoidance as well. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Kazuki.
Thanks, Waji. Hi, my name is Kazuki, and today I'm going to talk to you about how power distance directly affects financial decision making. As we discussed earlier today, we're focusing on two companies. One is from Goldman Sachs, and two is from Mitsubishi from Japan. However, before we delve into our questions, let's have a look at the overview of those two companies. Goldman Sachs. As you've probably heard from the news, Goldman Sachs is one of the leading investment securities and investment firms in the world. They operate around 14 countries and they have been successful since the operation. What about the qualitative goals of Goldman Sachs? Let's have a look at that too. Qualitative goals. For Goldman Sachs, one of the qualitative goals of Goldman Sachs is to reward employees who make significant investment to achieve notable success in supporting firms' core value, such as diversity, recruiting, and training. And now let's look at the Mitsubishi's overview. Mitsubishi is one of the biggest financial firms in Japan and operates in more than 40 countries in the world. However, for them, the qualitative goals are slightly different. For Mitsubishi, in order to achieve goals of succeeding, it is important to focus on customer satisfaction, which includes integrity and honesty. Because of that, I guess there are differences between two companies and how cultures influence those two companies. And let's look at the differences between the two cultures and how it will influence two companies that we have chosen. First, there are cultural differences between USA and Japan. There are lots of similarities between both countries, but there are many differences. For example, Americans tend to be more blunt and direct, whereas Japanese people are more subtle and they prefer social hierarchy is important for them. Another example is that for Japanese people, having a relationship with senior or junior managers are very important, and they always show respect and bow to those people who have the higher power. And I guess those are critical differences between America and Japan. And now let's look at the power distance for both countries. As you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram, power distance for Japan is higher than America. But what this means, as Roger explained before, power distance is about accepting a higher degree of unequally distributed power than do people in the other cultures. So having a higher power distance means the culture favors the relationship between bosses and subordinates as one of dependence. But how power distance influence both firms? For example, for Japan, they believe that power and authority are the facts of life, both consciously and unconsciously. Furthermore, cultures teach workers that everyone is not equal in this world, and that everybody has a rightful place. As a result, social hierarchy is prevalent and institutionalizes the inequalities. Whereas in America, cultures teach workers and people that everyone is equal and follows the idea of egalitarianism. This relates to Goldman Sachs, an organizational goal of encouraging and acquiring less powerful but more diverse bond underwriters and their continued dedication to diversifying the American financial industries. In a study done by Caroli in the Journal of Corporate Finance called The Gravity of Culture on Finance, a society's cultural feelings towards egalitarianism or lower power distance continues is often related to the regional investment flows. And this is such important, like as we discussed in the section, that having a higher power does influence the structure of the organization and also influence the decision making. Because, for example, Japan, as we discussed, that they have the higher distance power, which means that they rely on the top management's decision rather than your individual decisions. And like USA, they have the low power distance, but in fact, it gives them opportunities for individuals to make financial decisions. Thus, this is important for both firms and important for us to understand that power distance can influence our financial decision making. In our conclusion, I guess we could say that lower power distance like America views the world as everyone's equal. So that which means that the financial decision that they make is passed on by the individual or workers in general. It doesn't matter either it's top management's decision or your decisions. However, in Japan, I guess because they have the higher management powers, generally the general workers cannot have the rights to make a final decision on financial decisions. They have to wait and pass it on to the top management, and thus it would affect the financial decision making in overall. In concluding that it is true that par distance can affect financial decision making, and this tell us, all these research that we've done, they tell us that it is important to understand the difference between the power distance and how those affects the financial decision making.
As Waji explained, power distance is the extent to which lower-ranking individuals of a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. In order to articulate Hofstede's methodology and scale ranking, we use his institute's numbers to compare two countries, the US and Japan. Within management circles, it was generally assumed that there is a vast difference between the two countries. Surprisingly, the numbers were close, but nevertheless, the numbers do indicate that Japan has a higher power distance and that the US ranks as a lower power distance country. This is important as it has a significant effects on the workplace. So, effects on management style. Mitsubishi workers acknowledge their lesser standing and are respectful and submissive towards their superiors, who in turn are more likely to give orders rather than consult with their employees while making decisions. On the other hand, Goldman Sachs supervisors are more open to employee discussion and participation. Employees are less submissive to the superiors and are more likely to make themselves heard or to challenge management. Effect on employees' behavior of seeking advice. In Japan, people in higher positions hold greater amounts of power with little challenges. This hierarchical differentiation leads to invisible communication gaps where junior personnel are less likely to seek advice from superiors. Subsequently, employees at all levels will tend to deal with difficult issues by themselves rather than seeking advice elsewhere, which hinders individual, group, and organizational learning. Compared to Mitsubishi, Goldman Sachs is an organization where equality is embraced and authority and hierarchy are not highlighted, and supervisors are accessible and willing to build close relationships with subordinates, whose worries of any harm are turned down when seeking help from the top. Power distance and charitable behavior. Research has indicated that Japanese employees are generally less responsible towards charitable behaviors than workers from the US. Conversely, US workers are more sensitive toward any unequal, observable elements. Their unacceptance of dishonest endows them with greater sense of responsibility for adjusting or correcting issues face to face. Effects on autonomy. Power distance has a strong influence on whether society is more conformist or whether it practices more autonomy. In Japan, individuals tend to be more conformist and dependent, and thus would be less likely to engage in behavior that is not socially acceptable. Also, in the US, employees are not pressured to follow societal norms and are more likely to act according to their own wishes and desires, which happens a lot in Japan. Overall, Japan would be considered to have fluid but intrinsic inequalities, and this is true of Mitsubishi. Leaders are expected to be autocratic and to instruct their subordinates on what to do, where the organizational structure would be more centralized and resistance to authority is generally not appreciated. On the other hand, Goldman Sachs are deemed to rely on workers that demonstrate and believe in autonomy and fairness. As a rule, the leaders are commonly more approachable, where the leadership promotes and facilitates and empowers workers. Their organizational power base is typically decentralized with direct and two-way communication. So how does this affect Goldman Sachs and Mitsubishi? We learned earlier that Goldman Sachs has had trouble with the Japanese branches in the past to the point of the Japanese workers unionizing due to American managers refusing to provide equitable leave and respecting the wishes of Japanese workers regarding vacation days. So what can Goldman Sachs do? Goldman Sachs ought to implement strategies to bridge the gap of cultural distances to conduct team-building events and improve bonding and mutual understanding. Also, Japan has a culture that values the harmony and benefit of the collective, whereas American culture is typically to seek out personal benefit. So what can Goldman Sachs do in this case? Upper management ought to realize that this is not that important and should yield to the cultural value that Japanese workers value. This would increase the employees' expectations in future conflicts and would increase input toward quality decision making, but increase the trust level between managers and employees in their sections, because values play a huge role in decision making. This includes financial decisions. Thirdly, since cultures that are more trusting have a greater participation in the stock market, Goldman Sachs ought to implement regular training and development sessions with all levels of employees. This increases organizational learning by providing benefit to organizations through an improved business strategy, improved effectiveness, and improved employee recruitment and training. It also benefits employees with intrinsic benefits that help them perform their jobs better. And intrinsic benefits, such as higher earnings as a result of increased knowledge and skills, improved marketability, greater job security, and enhanced opportunities for advancement. Since Mitsubishi is a global company, they have to pull themselves away from being a high-power distance organization. This will allow them to attract and retain the best workers in each company and each country that they serve. Having said that, Mitsubishi relies on attributes of a high-power distance society to maintain order and discipline in their hierarchical structure. Their structure does provide an avenue to retain their employees, as job security is a must and organizational cohesiveness is important. Mitsubishi should also conduct training and development sessions to employ this across all levels of the structure of their company. So to reiterate what we have discussed, it is imperative for financial institutions to account for their cultural differences, as they play an integral role in both the culture of the firm, but also the execution and success of several financial decisions. Goldman Sachs emphasizes the qualities of a low-power distance country by aiming to diversify the market on several levels by protecting less powerful actors within the industry. In an alternative case, Mitsubishi embodies the qualities of a low-power distance culture by placing a greater stress on the calls of those in top levels of hierarchical structure. Overall, within the financial industry, power distance hinders an employee's ability to reach a company's qualitative goals for Japanese managers with American workers, and vice versa, by several indicators. First, by sustaining differentiation that generates conflict. Second, by preserving ambiguous rules. 3, by maintaining interdependence between employees and managers. And lastly, consequently stunting communication, mutual understanding, and individual, group, and organizational learning. We hope this presentation has not only highlighted the differences in power distance between America and Japan, but effectively used Goldman Sachs and Mitsubishi to illustrate Hofstede's principles' importance to the financial firms.